Good evening, everyone. I think we're going to get started. I know that people are still coming on. So far, we have 462 participants. I'm Isla Berman for our guests, Dean of the School of Architecture at UVA, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Medalists in Architecture lecture this evening with Marion, Weiss, and Michael MANFREDI. Before I start with an introduction, I'm just going to tell everybody a couple of ground rules for our event this evening. First of all, you have all been muted in advance so that there isn't any background noise, and we control the muting and unmuting of you. We will open it up at 2 points during the event this evening, one time at the end of the lecture so that you can live clap. Because we haven't quite figured out how to do all of this on Zoom, but live clapping from a large audience would be nice. There will be 2 moments for that at the end of the lecture and then at the end of the evening after the discussion and questions. After the lecture, I'm going to introduce Marion and Michael. They will give their talk. And at the end, I'm going to start with opening up the discussion with about 3 questions and then open it up to the audience. I would ask all of you, if you have a question, to write it in the chat box and I will read the question aloud. There are many people right now communicating through the chat box. You can feel free to do that, but for questions, maybe write question. The chat box is at the very bottom of your screen. For those of you who aren't doing Zoom on a daily basis multiple times a day, you just click on the chat box and at the very bottom in the right-hand corner to everyone or to the panelists, you can type your message. So let's get started. First, it is truly my honor to present Marion Weiss and Michael MANFREDI, partners of the New York-based firm Weiss MANFREDI, as our 55th recipients of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation Medal in Architecture. Recipients of the New York American Institute of Architects Gold Medal of Honor, the New York AIA President's Award, a Fast Company Innovation by Design Award, and the Cooper Hewitt National Design Award for Architectural Design. Weiss and MANFREDI have been lauded for their significant contributions to culture and education through their many award-winning projects, from the Seattle Art Museum's Olympic Sculpture Park, an ingenious synthesis of architecture, landscape, and infrastructure, to the Diana Center for Barnard College at Columbia University and the Singh Center for Nanotechnology at the University of Pennsylvania. Weiss MANFREDI have been critically redefining the relationship between landscape, architecture, infrastructure, and urbanism through their work, which not only underscores the significance that Thomas Jefferson attributed to these intertwined realms, but also speaks to the necessity, especially in our current age, to transcend traditional disciplinary boundaries and create newly integrated cultural, ecological paradigms. At a time of great divisions and disparities, Weiss and MANFREDI's practice is one of creating continuities, conceptual, formal, spatial, and programmatic. As partners, they're invested in stitching together those things that have become separated over time, enabling not only a much needed bridging across fields that have become overly specialized, but also the reconnection of cultural norms with ecological necessities, architectural form with living matter, and the choreography of human experience with the temporalities and metabolisms of natural systems operating both within and outside of our perceptual field. Weiss and MANFREDI are highly ingenious and opportunistic, I would say, in the best sense of the word, resuscitating contaminated wastelands while providing access to the public realm for populations that have been marginalized. Their work is not only a much needed response to the fragmentation and commodification of our urban realm, but also an attempt to heal sites, such as the one upon which the Seattle Park was developed, that have been instrumentalized, abused, and then discarded. The transformation of coastal urban brownfields from the Olympic Sculpture Park in Seattle to the Hunters Point South Waterfront Park and Long Island City have breathed new life back into these cities, while generating truly public spaces that support inclusiveness and social equity. Despite the operative strength, I would also say, of the forms that characterize their works, zigzagging lines and folded and curvilinear surfaces that connect and mobilize rather than contain the living, their work is often perceived less as a set of formal types than as the effects and experiential conditions that they both produce and animate. Theirs is truly a cinematic architecture that unfolds over time, amplifying the dynamic movements of occupation while simultaneously emphasizing the changing nature of experience that underscores our humanity and our sensitivity and connection to the world around us. Innovative, thoughtful, and carefully crafted, their works are energetic, powerful, and beautiful. Urban social condensers and light-filled and habitable landscapes that express the profound cultural significance and transformative potential of our design disciplines. On behalf of the School of Architecture, it is my great privilege to introduce Marion Weiss and Michael MANFREDI, the 2020 recipients of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation Medal in Architecture. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Isla, thank you so much for your very generous introduction and for situating the importance of what we believe this moment in architecture needs to welcome, which is things that really stretch outside of our discipline. We are deeply honored to be recipients of the Thomas Jefferson Medal for Architecture and are really humbled to be part of this distinguished roster of architects. It's also a special privilege to be recognized this year with Sonia Sotomayor, Dr. Rajiv J. Shah, and Ted Turner, who we'd like to congratulate for their incredible vision and leadership. So, in a sense, when we actually think about the interconnectivity of our world, we actually also think about a time when natural and public realms are increasingly threatened. And Thomas Jefferson provided a kind of enduring inspiration. He believed deeply in connecting value and gave measure to the connections between science and the humanities, creating common ground through the uncommon grounds of the University of Virginia. And of course, he's elevated our sense of responsibility to be citizens of the world.
That Jefferson saw a more expansive and more broadly defined role for architecture has been a great provocation for our work. We're deeply moved by his conviction that architecture's relationship to the landscape was not just an abstraction, but instead central to the geography of human development. Jefferson, in his own work, recognized that architecture is first and foremost a social art. As such, it requires a collaboration of a vast array of protagonists. We've been fortunate to work with enlightened clients, engaged citizens, talented architects and designers in our own studio, artists, thinkers, specialists that we've had the privilege of working with. Together, they've enriched the trajectory of the projects that we will share with you tonight. The constructed natural worlds are often seen as oppositional, and yet this paradox is at the heart of so many of the challenges that we as architects need to engage. Rather, we're interested in a more fluid connection between architecture, infrastructure, art, and ecology, and the dynamic space between these territories has been both sight and inspiration for our work.
And you know, it's really the territories of these elements, the territories of architecture that we believe should concern itself with the whole of the built environment. And while the range of each discipline has expanded, arguably one could say that heightened disciplinary distinctions have also emerged. And we believe they're largely administrative, and they've placed artificial boundaries on the extent and ambitions of the architectural project. And we think this is a poignant situation, particularly as we reflect on this deeply tragic pandemic that we are a part of right now, that illuminates the necessary connections between all the arts and sciences to address the most globally pressing challenges of our time. And in fact, there's a temptation to say that there's a utopian ideal for the perfect, contained, fortified world, whether it be the Renaissance ideal city or even the temporary Pelotes, where these temporary cities, where in fact encircling the wagons was the idea. And yet we believe there really is more of a networked idea where we could kind of leverage topographies and infrastructures to create new cultural destinations. And Jefferson had such a strong feeling about being able to literally give measure to a site that might be amorphous between land and water to in fact situate an idea in his drawing here for Washington, D.C. as a national capital. And as he was stretching this east and west, it really was an image that we looked at with great care when we entered the Women's Memorial Competition at Arlington Cemetery, our first project that launched our practice. And his vision was one that was carried across the river with the Memorial Bridge and terminated at Arlington Cemetery. And so this memorial there to honor the women who'd served in the military since the Revolutionary War became, in a sense, a site where an unrecognized group and an unrecognized retaining wall had an opportunity to actually be taking a forgotten site and a forgotten subject and actually break barriers, literally and figuratively, through this old retaining wall to create a place and a space for recognition of the women who'd served. And so in this first competition, which launched our practice, we literally had to work with the walls and retaining walls to break through the artifact of this 1927 retaining wall to create a space of light and of education. And actually, through that ascent, connect to Arlington Cemetery grade, which then with a 200-foot diameter arc of glass tablets could become literally like a journal with the binding broken with the inscriptions of and about the women who had served, to become this luminous landscape as a foreground to the cemetery, but also to be able to allow the sun to treat it like a kind of a light narrative, that the shadows could be telling that story inside the memorial gallery as well. For us, really, it was this incredibly humbling opportunity to be part of an incredibly important landscape and ultimately connect this story of these women who had served, whose stories needed to be heard as part of the monumental landscape of monumental Washington.
So this next project, and both of these, by the way, the Women's Memorial was our very first project. This was also an early project that I think allowed us to explore a series of themes that you'll see presented tonight. And the Museum of the Earth draws its inspiration from this remarkable geology of the Finger Lakes. It's located as part of Cornell in Ithaca, New York. And it's an idea about the story of both geology and biology and the presence of water in the formation of this incredible landscape. So maybe you can see a small museum engages its incredible site and organizes parking so that water can be collected. And increasingly, water, of course, is a precious resource. And even upstate New York, the presence of water being cleaned and allowed to reemerge into Lake Cayuga was an important driver for this design. So water is actually, in a way, the first part of this narrative. You can park your car. Parking is kind of concealed between a series of berms where water is collected, cleansed by equisetum, and then carried in this very long and very processional trough. And that trough then allows you to register the entry to the museum. And rather than one building, we broke the museum into two pavilions, shared entry plaza, and those in turn are connected below grade. So the buildings are nested into the topography. They become part of the landform themselves. And you can start to see the kind of development of this idea where architecture both emerges from the land, but is also emergent from the land and in turn embeds itself into the topography. The idea was, rather than create the typical black box museum where the kind of natural history is described in small and very precise dioramas, we really wanted to make sure that this story, the story of the Finger Lakes, could be connected to the region. So the fossils that are displayed in this museum are found in the landscape itself, in the geology of this region. So it's an idea of a kind of Guggenheim in reverse. You sort of enter in the present and you're confronted with a right whale, this beautiful skeletal structure. Then you descend down to the lowest level where you can see a Devonian fossil. And in that fossil is the kind of skeletal remains of a trilobite. And you can remark on the similarity between present and past. And that sense of being below grade in the earth is as much an idea of procession as it is revealing the artifacts of the earth. Water is collected, as I mentioned, between these two pavilions, deposited into a glacial garden. At times it freezes. The concrete itself is very much produced with local stone, so it kind of has the kind of character of the stone that you would find on site. And in fact, the kind of imperfections of the concrete reveal a series of fossil-like indentations in the concrete itself. Water's collected. At this point, it's cleansed and then can be discharged into a detention area, and where now there's probably about several hundred new types of life form that has developed in this detention area. The detention area, in turn, allows the water to descend to Lake Cayuga clean. So this narrative of the earth, of water, and the shaping of the earth is also a narrative that we developed in a more contemporary project, a more recent project, the Brooklyn Botanic Garden Visitor Center. And here it's very much about the intersection of the kind of the oasis of the garden in a dense city like New York and a very dense borough like Brooklyn. So how to transition from city to garden? And rather than create a discrete, single, very beautiful building, perhaps, the idea was to think of the building as part of a journey, part of a narrative, a sequential act that was as much a part of the garden as it was the city. And those sort of explorations, the sort of origami-like studies where the building could, in a sense, dissolve into the garden or assert itself into the city, are evident in these early study models. So the building is overtly architectural. As it presents itself to the city, it's broad, there's a welcome plaza. You can slide under the building, under the canopy, and never enter the building. And in some sense, it's our idea that this building and other projects not be seen as objects unto themselves, but fragments of a much larger context. So you can slide around the building, you can see it panoramically. The building's actually 400 feet long. You never quite experience it that way. It's always an idea about seduction, rounding a corner, taking its shape from, in this case, a very, very beautiful cherry tree. Ultimately, you can go inside and discover the mysteries, the beauties of a botanic garden, the kind of horticultural, botanical research that occurs here. And perhaps you could also pause in an event space that's used for a whole host of community events. Ultimately, you can enter the building from the garden itself, from an elevated sectional idea where you slide across the roof into looking down into the building. And then here the kind of biological and mineral qualities are seen as symbiotic. The building and its landscape have a certain reciprocity.
And this reciprocity is really a chameleon expression of the building. As you can see below, part architectural and above, part landscape. And yet on occasion, it becomes almost 100% natural as it reaches the end of its 400-foot stretch to become part of the garden. And it really, in this case, is an inhabitable topography as its intent unfolds. And as an inhabitable topography, it actually collects water both on the roof for the garden, but also into a series of rain gardens that then filter their way into the rest of the 52-acre ecosystem, if you will, of the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. But that idea of something that is always changing and always alive, you know, has a seasonal character. And here is the roof during the kind of fall when the grasses acquire that strange kind of crew cut effect. And then actually from that upper Belvedere that Michael mentioned, it really is a whisper that hugs and hovers above the walkways in the section. And if it hovers on this end, you could say from the heart of the garden, it also becomes a kind of a lantern that's a conservatory that's really open all times of the day. And yet, certainly from the Japanese garden, we wanted it to be a whisper, barely there and barely evident except as a kind of conservatory beyond the trees. So the question then of a visitor center that's in the garden but part of the city literally translates in this image in our mind as something that's 100% architecture and urban on one side, and then 100% natural as it makes its way into the city. kind of cinematic expression and also the seasonal change is something that we love to see captured throughout the year. And that idea of sort of what happens when a gateway is embedded into the landscape. In the case of the NOVARTIS Visitor Center, it was a very different question. In this case, it is a place that literally the questions of what a barrier might be if it was a gateway and a threshold for security, what could it be if it were opened up ever so slightly to become something that is welcoming and yet still contains itself within the landscape. And so for the Novartis campus, which is a pharmaceutical campus and needs to actually keep private many of the research elements that are private, how could they, though, invite people to the campus and welcome them in? And so we took a very simple idea, the straight line, which was the boundary between the public and the private realm, and skewed it ever so slightly to open it up into an earthwork that could bring you in and be greeted, so that from that point, you would begin to be part of that threshold of joining the campus. And from the campus side, then, all of a sudden, the stretch of that landscape unfolds and welcomes you to a collection of buildings that are doing both research and work. It's really this idea, though, of gently resting into the land that allows this sense of it to be almost invisible in some orientations, but certainly to the public, it is simultaneously an inhabited topography, but also celestial soffit that is a kind of welcoming gateway 24 hours a day. So at Barnard College, again, the question of what a gateway is to a campus, it was something that had perhaps a very different expression in the 60s. And this was the Campus Center for Barnard College, Macintosh, done in the 60s, recognizing that you need to protect people from the frightening aspect of the city. And so this was what remained. Now, in fact, right behind that wall, there was a major historic garden that was beautiful for the core of the campus, and then the expanded campus had a beautiful open lawn separated by about 20 feet of grade change. And so for us, the question was, could we actually take a program of over 100,000 square feet that would have been a box, and could we taper it a bit and actually use the idea of landscape to pull it up and through to create a new setting? And so could we in fact even take the huge concrete foundations as our framework and basis for building a new ascending sort of connected campus center and art center and performing arts center into something that would become a legible lantern as part of the city? And I think what was remarkably important to both the president and the provost at Barnard was to say that we don't want to conceal, but we want to reveal that which is going on. And that revelation is connected interdependently across the multiple floors here. The view from the cafe below connects us ultimately to the art and architecture review spaces. So it's a collapsed set of Tiffany windows from the inside that actually is sort of unfurled as a magic carpet from the gallery critique spaces through the reading room and down to the cafe, et cetera.
So if on the Broadway side, the kind of facade presents itself in a very expansive way, on the campus side, it was also an opportunity to create connections of a different sort. And here, at the time, and you can start to see, it was a very significant change of grade, impossible for someone in a wheelchair to move from one part of campus to the other. So architecture became an opportunity, in a way, an alibi, to create a much more connected, interconnected campus. So in the foreground, you can see the historic courtyard of Barnard College, and then as you ascend, you reach the much more public parts of Barnard. If connection is important in terms of the development of the ground plane, it's also a particular challenge in a multi-story building, particularly an arts building, which requires a high level of interconnectivity. And here we played with the idea of the stair as being an opportunity to, in a way, resist the balkanization that occurs floor by floor. So the stair, rather than being embedded in the building, is pulled out. So students always sense the geography, the sense of where they are relative to both inside and outside. And the inside and outside, I think, in a way is marked by the presence of this building being in a predominantly brick campus, in a predominantly brick neighborhood. And yet we were interested in the idea of asserting a certain differentiation while still paying homage to the brick campuses and the campus's neighbors. So we played with both an ancient and a contemporary material, which is glass, and looked at different ways in which glass could, in a way, harmonize. And that idea of harmonizing, in a way, grew out of maybe the accident of a sketch. And both Marion and I find that the act of drawing is a way in which we can kind of think about architecture. But here, the accident of charcoal on paper, on rough paper, also led us to think of ways in which we could explore the idea of fritting, the idea of a kind of a porcelain baked on finish into the glass that might give a little bit of an illusion of whether something was transparent, translucent, or opaque. And here you can start to see that kind of chromatic interchange between the building and its context. In this case, very early morning light, it becomes a bright brick red. And then at night, it becomes a darker bronze. And in effect, the kind of exterior of the building becomes much more prominent. In this case, a frontage, a Tiffany window, as Marion mentioned, on Broadway. A different relationship to the city, but I think equally important, and we should say have become fascinated with which ways in which we can think of campuses as being much more porous. The idea of a fortified campus has, I think, no meaning in our contemporary culture. So the idea here was to build a nanotechnology lab, a multidisciplinary nanotechnology lab at the University of Pennsylvania in an era that was defined by very hermetic buildings. And you can see this context, very little green space, very, very heavy gravity-bound buildings. And rather than kind of continue that trope, we really were interested in looking at ways in which we could build on the language of interconnected open spaces that make the University of Pennsylvania such a beautiful campus. So our building is located, you can see it defined by the little red figure, and the creation of another defined courtyard. In this case, a defined courtyard on Walnut Street, which is one of the major streets that connects both campus and city. So the idea of this hermetic lab, which often are treated apart from their context, the idea was to break it open, to create a courtyard that would invite. In that sense, that invitation is first and foremost the creation of a public green, a truly public green that's open to the public, evident on Walnut Street, that through this sort of thin sheet of glass reveals the incredible research and provides an invitation into the building. And the idea of collecting water, in this case, the green is also a reservoir for water, also means that we can use water on site and not discharge it into the storm system of Philadelphia. So you walk through this open green into a very broad, almost public lobby, a kind of a threshold space between the public street, Walnut Street, and the laboratories, which you see here defined behind this very beautiful saffron color, which is actually a scientifically precise color that is used in clean room design. And that clean room design is an incredible machine, beautiful in its own right, and it's something that rather than hide, we wanted to celebrate. And that celebration becomes an opportunity not only for the researchers to feel that they are part of a campus, but also to feel like the visitor is in fact being part of a protagonist in the research that's occurring. And that research, again, is part and parcel of the, I guess, the definition, the architecture of this quasi-public lobby.
The interesting element about the program here was to say, how could we actually reveal and actually connect all the labs and the community that are here? And in fact, what you can start to see here is a staircase that actually has a kind of very important job, because elevators cause vibration and electromagnetic interference. They interfere with the work in the labs. So the stair needed to actually be very compelling so that people would find it central and easy to use, and yet also be able to collaborate on each of the intermediate levels and extend that conversation and collaboration for the building. And that idea of actually the invitation of it being a cross-disciplinary building means that being able to be within eyesight of the conferences and the meetings that are going on could actually draw a conversation into focus. That ultimate focus there in the forum, the Glant Forum at the very, very top, is a place where over 100 people could convene. And as they convene, they could actually become a spotlight within the city and on the campus, and one that actually hovers over the urban edge to give a kind of frame by which we can actually look back at the clean room and its amber light glowing. And finally, actually say that that notion of glowing and opening the kind of sciences, literally and figuratively, to the city and to the university is one where this kind of cross-disciplinary purpose-built Seeing Center, I think, is hopefully transforming that engagement across the disciplines. And we do believe, since it's an urban building, literally it's one of the fabric of the city unfolds outwards. Big jump here. Different kind of campus altogether. And at Roosevelt Island, Cornell Tech, there was an initiative that Bloomberg was central to seeing realized to create a campus for technology somewhere within the New York metropolitan area. And Cornell Tech and Technion together came up with a bid to actually take this particular site, which seems so isolated in some ways, to create it now as a new central hub for Cornell Tech. And our building, the Cornell Tech co-location building, in many ways had this incredible capacity to experience river-to-river views, albeit the master plan identified it a pretty awkward, blocky building for over 200,000 square feet. And our first thought was, what a terrible thing to miss that opportunity to connect river-to-river views. So why not actually open it up into a pair of buildings that could make that connected element, and then draw indoor and outdoor environments together, and actually recognize that being on this aquatic sort of island means that we need to think about resilience in very new terms. So the elevating of it is not only just elevating it for flood, but actually creating interconnected stairs to allow the community between the academy and industry to connect, because that's really the dedicated idea of co-location. And that those connections actually join the dialogue with the other buildings, both existing and emerging on the campus. So here you can see the idea of the building breaking not into one box, but two wings to open up a central park, if you will, and a central space where one could actually be invited in an amphitheater of green that softens that threshold between the amphitheater inside that connects the community together.
So this invitation, this kind of idea, like at Penn, of making research evident, you can start to see the building alternately spills out onto the plaza, or the plaza invades the building. And in a way, this is our kind of, this is the town square, the town piazza. It's also, I think you can see an homage to the Spanish Steps, where the inhabitation, the idea of topography, the idea of moving up through a building is as important as the spaces that are served by the stair. So you can slide up. At times you take in views of Manhattan. At times you take in this case, a very beautiful view of the Queensboro Bridge and Queens in the distant background. You slide up, and as you move through the building, you get glimpses of the research. Sometimes you can actually participate in seeing the studio environment of a lot of research that's occurring there, a lot of digital research. You can also find places to take that kind of research, that sort of very intense research, and move it out into a more felicitous and more light-filled location. In this case, the prow of one of the two wings of the building. And that prow becomes a way in which, for us, the kind of importance of locating a building and a setting and a place in a kind of geography of a larger context is a really, is a very important attribute. And then finally, the journey ends with the hope that the researcher and the intense research that's occurring inside the labs is evident and becomes a participant in the larger world, the larger context. So the kind of context at a very different kind of setting was an opportunity to create a building for Kent State that linked the town of Kent, but also the university itself. And this is a Center for Architecture and Environmental Design. And here, Kent, part of northern Ohio, an area that was extraordinarily productive at the turn of the century in terms of its factories. Well, here we took the kind of factory loft building and elevated it to create a kind of interior topography. And in so doing, the idea was to create an entirely public ground plane, a ground plane that could be public both to the town and to the campus. So you can see that registration, that kind of internal topography where the studios ascend and alternately the public forum, the public gallery descends to the town. And that section, that kind of MRI registers in how the building presents itself. So you can kind of understand the kind of formal disposition of the building by reading, in effect, its facade. So here you see the public street, cafe, library, auditorium. You can ascend from that much more public ground floor to the elevated topography of the studio lofts, where different disciplines, environmental design, engineering, architecture, landscape, are all interrelated and interwoven and cohabitate. So you can see how you can look up into the different departments. Instead of walls, they become different trays, or alternately, you can look down. And here on the very first day, everything's kind of, I suppose, nicely organized. We love the idea of debris. We love the idea that students have appropriated their own spaces for making projects, for making different discoveries, for entertaining different kinds of research. Alternately, on the more public side of the ground floor is the library. And the library at times is open to the public and becomes a much more discrete set of rooms.
Just as the building in many ways is really designed to support a level of collaboration that occurs inside, we were very interested in collaborating with the architecture of the community around. Mm-hmm. And the brick, the residential and the brick of both the campus and of the town was something that inspired us to work closely with Belden Brook to find, in fact, their most ancient technology with the beehive kiln that creates through the differential heat, different colors within one brick batch. And that difference was something we wanted to actually expand on even further through dimension and work with them to come up with a custom brick that would actually allow us to project out in a new kind of meter, something that was both tactile and engaging for every member, even those who aren't even students. And as you can see, depending on the time of day and time of night, the glass is reflecting nature, but the brick itself is metering the sunlight and actually casting shadows across the facade. This question, though, of what advances and what recedes, certainly as it faces the campus side, we wanted a great sort of movie screen to let you know that this is probably the only building that's in use 24 hours on campus. And mm-hmm. Truly, it's a sight to be seen. Any kind of architectural charrette at the end of the year is illuminated and lit up. And that lighting up of each one of the ascending trays of the studios is seen on the oblique as one walks into town. And this is literally the building trying to connect town and gown. And yet I think for us, it's the collapsing of these worlds of town and university and kind of research and invention that situates, I think, for us, the great gift of this project in the university and in the city.
So this is very much a work in progress. We're honored to be working on reimagining the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi, India. And I think there's an incredible wealth of inspiration that comes from the very rich and very ancient traditions of Indian architecture. But what really struck us is the sort of relationship between garden and architecture. They're in such a careful and delicate balance where you can't quite discern if the garden predominates or the architecture predominates. So that sort of sense, that careful balance was inspirational to us and to how we might rethink and reimagine the embassy. This is the first building on the embassy compound produced by Edward Durrell Stone, a very beautiful building that recalls the kind of grandeur of the Taj Mahal. And this building was part of kind of a very active program of bringing American diplomacy to the world, a kind of sense of a kind of a global responsibility. And to this day, the embassy in New Delhi is one of the most important in the world. So you can see in this early sketch, the Edward Durrell Stone Building is kind of figured on the left-hand side of our screen, whereas our new addition pulls back and is kept at the same height in deference. The two are connected below grade through a series of adjusted platforms that catch water and bring in natural light. The challenge here was to actually, in a way, be somewhat oblique in terms of how new and old buildings would interchange with each other. And we started by actually mapping out a potential route. And that potential route actually becomes a kind of a tapis vert, a kind of green carpet that more than the architecture connects new and old, existing and proposed. And so here you can start to see it probably 20 years from now, full development of the campus. And that green spine is the kind of governing agent, our response to the kind of great tradition of Mughal architecture. But the haptic realm is, I think, what was particularly important, particularly in a hot climate like India, where you enter through a grove of Dolonex trees to provide shade to cool you. And the idea of the architecture also responsive to this climate, the idea of building on the tradition of jolly screens. And you can see on our new building on the right, a kind of woven facade which provides views in and out, but still dampens this very harsh, bright sunlight. Similarly, the kind of horizontal canopy is an homage both to the Edward Durrell Stone Building, but also provides shade and captures water. And the idea of capturing water, the kind of sense of an environmental agenda, which is actually quite ancient to India, is also an opportunity to think and rethink the role of diplomacy relative to the United States.
You could argue that there's an incredible history too that might be far deeper even than our diplomatic history, and that is our paleontological history. And some of you may know the La Brea tar pits. Certainly, we all grew up with it in our experiences of travel. Yet what has been so amazing about being fortunate to win the competition to reimagine La Brea tar pits as a master plan is to go back to the very essence of what that tar truly did, which is trapped and preserved, and actually has become an incredibly enduring site here in this urban place of Los Angeles for 365 days of excavation, of revelation and research. So what a crazy thing to have both science, a museum, a community park, and you're literally on Wilshire Boulevard, the Miracle Mile in Los Angeles. And all of these things together, really, as we started to map the site, were curious things. We found that excavation and research was concentrated in one place we called research and revelation. Community and culture was sort of concentrated around the museum and the central green, and the spectacle and urban fiction of the lake pit and the tar and even the mammoths, the animated mammoths, started to lead to the question of how could we, in fact, connect and create a loop that might wander through and intersperse itself between science, research, revelation, and community, and literally create new gateways to this lens. And so as a kind of green, fertile destination, as one of the few green parks in all of this area in Los Angeles, we also wanted to actually say that you could be pulled from one edge of the city to the other and connect all of these elements of museum, of research, and community and culture. So what happens? The original Page Museum, which we actually really liked, though, was 100% concealed within a berm of earth. And so our desire was not so much to remove it, but to build upon it with an expanded plinth, and then carve within that plinth a new window or lens into both the research, the collections, and the science, and literally embrace and invite the community in around this central green. It's a place, though, where at night it could become entirely different in terms of what it projects. It could tell stories that we have never seen. And ultimately, it could collapse the question of what is inside the incredible fossils in the collection and collapse our experience of what it is to be part of the public and to be part of this adventure in science. Now, from science to connections brings us to the Olympic Sculpture Park. And I think that's really a very interesting question when we are thinking about what it means to create a public destination in the city. And in this case, it's a city and a waterfront that's been separated by infrastructure, by train lines, by highways, by contamination, by a 40-foot grade change, and in many ways kept the city from the water's edge. So when the museum asked the question of how could we create a sculpture park free and open to the public on this particular site, we discovered it was, of course, 3 sites, and went through a head-scratching infrastructural x-ray to figure out how we could do everything from connect to the city to create salmon habitat. That infrastructural x-ray became distilled into something very, very precise, a set of layers that we could go from sculpture, art, landscape, architecture, infrastructure, remediation, and then literally start to think of an MRI section that could effectively craft a disposition from urban to natural across this switchback. And so what you see here literally is not 3 separate sites, but one continuous landform that wanders from the city to the water's edge. And literally in this case, 200,000 cubic yards of earth were pulled from one end of the city to the other to create this new topography that could traverse the highway and make its way across the train tracks to the water's edge. It literally had to utilize the infrastructural language of highway building, in this case mechanically stabilized earth and precast walls, to situate literally the vista of art and the Olympic mountains beyond. And in fact, this idea of a kind of wandering switchback to enhance a sense of length and distance in a park was something that also informed the disposition of the building, which truly was a microcosm of this unfolding and sort of ascending landscape that literally could open up to reveal a very simple Kunststall, kind of tough and raw and open to the light, in great contrast to, say, so many of the white boxes that celebrate art. In this case, you could see Pedro Reyes' work in the cupolas, leading to a kind of connection to the boundary between landscape and architecture being shaped by the new invented topography.
And we like the ambiguity between what's inside and outside, what becomes an outdoor room and an indoor room. So in this case, we like the sense that, and we hope that the reading of this might be that the pavilion frames Richard Serra's really beautiful and fluid sculpture, in this case called Wake. Alternately, we love the idea that Wake might in fact inform the shaping of the pavilion itself. So the sort of sense that there's an ambiguity between inside and outside for us is a provocation in terms of how to define both architecture and landscape. We love also the fact that in public settings, people appropriate open space in ways that we never imagined. In this case, the development of an ongoing film festival and an ongoing set of performances when the weather's beautiful in Seattle. Again, never part of the program, but we love the sort of the sense that there is an opportunity to inhabit and appropriate. And this idea of appropriation has also led us to the sense that you could wander from the city to the water's edge. And in so doing, you cross the infrastructure, you don't hide it, you reveal it. And in this case, we are dead center over Elliott Avenue, a very wide avenue that extends from the inner harbor to the outskirts of Seattle. So here we privilege the landscape rather than creating a bridge that reveals itself to the highway. We privilege the landscape so that you can slide over the highway and, like on a golf course, try to extend the perceptual reading of a setting so that it appears much larger than it actually is. And that sense of engagement with the city could also be a provocation to a passing driver who might not know anything about art and wonder, what is that red thing? Who is Calder and why is he doing work like that? Why did he do work like that? That provocation extends to the trains. And here we were really enamored with the idea that trains could be conceived of as kinetic elements, kinetic sculptures that change the kind of formal characteristics by their presence in the park as they slide through. In this case, under a bridge that is defined by a very beautiful artwork by the artist Teresita Fernandez called Seattle Cloud Cover. And that artwork in a way, plays optical games with the retaining walls in this sort of serendipitous moment where the light passes through and the retaining walls become reflectors for this magical quality. And if this magical quality extends to the water's edge, it's our hope, in this case, that we could finally reconnect to the city. And the city's connection to the water was defined by parking, in this case, parking with a great view, but you could never quite touch the water. So here was an opportunity to work with the city to create a new public waterfront, a waterfront that would define itself as both a setting for art or just simply a place to fall asleep and take a nap. And the sense of tidal movement, tidal movements off Elliott Bay are significant. So we had an opportunity to actually create a new beach. And while this beach looks absolutely informal, it's incredibly hydrologically and precisely engineered so that we could create salmon habitat. And the byproduct of that kind of engineering is also the collection of the kind of ephemera, the flotsam and jetsam of life, in this case, driftwood that wanders onto the beach and creates a very, very beautiful setting. And that setting translates to, I think, one of the things that we're most proud of in the formation of the Olympic Sculpture Park, which is the creation or the reintroduction of salmon habitat, in effect creating a new underwater garden. And that underwater garden for us is as important as the public presence, the overt presence of open space in the city. And we'd like to just share a film, and we've included film to kind of try to give you a sense of movement through sound, in this case, sounds of the city, which are very powerful. He's so cute, huh?
So literally, the whole idea of transforming waterfronts as they have been colonized by industry is something that is not only common to Seattle and the Northwest, but it's also common, of course, to our coast in New York. And in this case, what we're showing here is the location of the Hunters Point South Waterfront Park. And what's remarkable here is while it's precise in its acreage, it is imprecise in how many views it can capture and draw into the identity of it. So here you can see the old kind of float bridge that would connect the kind of trading post that it was, if you will, for industry and exchange. And yet that site, Hunters Point South Waterfront Park, was truly a kind of a landfill site, a brownfield site, and it concealed what had been, in fact, an incredible wetland before it became this place of industry. Yeah. And when you think of all those histories coming together, in fact, what was left over was this very curious collection of buildings, contaminated site, and a very irregular edge that was fortified on one side and then very rough and raw on the other. And so what became interesting for us was to say in our kind of collaboration with EDC, with ARAB, with Thomas Balsey Associates, Parks Department, what's the question that needs to be asked here? How can we create something in advance of a development that was to follow as a destination park that would connect literally all these different precincts? So what you see is a kind of translation of a 3,800 linear feet of shoreline, where part of it is hard, if you will, to the left side of your screen, but roughly 88% of it could be a soft edge, where we kind of re-envision what a wetland landscape might be to be inhabited. The design is really a lasso link that concentrates at one end the kind of active recreation, and at the other unfurls with a kind of cantilevered overlook that looks back towards the city and capitalizes on the fact that this is probably the most topographically diverse site in all of Long Island City. Now, what you'll start to see, though, is that resilience is really got to be taken into consideration with any waterfront site. And Hurricane Sandy in 2012 brought it into focus. It had been our premise as we were thinking about this park to recognize that we needed to not only so much resist water to protect the upland community, but we might want to think about new forms of resilience by embracing the water and designing in such a way that we could envision the central green and even the island that you see floating and almost disappearing here as vulnerable to but welcoming the provocation of water. So this was a rendering that wasn't necessarily enthusiastically embraced initially, but after Hurricane Sandy, I think became a symbol of the poster child that this project could become for future parks along the waters to Edge, to actually embrace both the idea of a community destination, but also a place that could also protect and receive water. Underneath this green here is a great cistern that collects, so that there's sort of a catch and release program for water. But what you can also see is this kind of crescent of green facing the core central green is then backed by a pavilion. There had been a query about 4 architectural objects that would be on the site: a shade pavilion, a concession building, restrooms, a maintenance building. And we thought that it would be far better to pull these all together into something that could be barely there at one end and open and unfurl with a lens to the city. And so what you can see with this pavilion itself is that it is a hardworking pavilion in that while it can actually host and change large communities, it's one that could actually take a southern facing edge of the fleet to collect solar energy so that the lighting for the park could be powered by this rooftop, but also collect water so that the water could actually tip down the channels and actually help irrigate the park. And so that idea of being a hardworking element that is barely there is one that we also hope to be a kind of a friendly sort of face to all these things that could be objects one after another, but now they are one because of another. It's also a beach on the other side of the pavilion where what had been water taxi beach can now actually be a family beach. And there is, in fact, even older artifacts like the rails that used to be the places of exchange are now places of cultivation and invitations for the rail garden for the community. And truly, though, it is something interesting to be able to invent a park in advance of the development of the city that follows. And so the dedicated precincts along this first phase actually situated us for the second phase of the project that followed. The threshold link here being the place where the ferry comes and goes.
So this becomes a new ferry connection, which is becoming increasingly important to the life of many cities, and certainly New York, whose real history, whose genesis was all about its harbor and its waterfront. But we were also intrigued with the idea of, in a way, using architecture to make measurable what might, in a way, be seen but not quite understood. So the sense of giving measure to this spectacular view was something that we hoped would become apparent even to the most casual of passerbys. The second phase of the park, which we've just completed, takes this, former set of wetlands, a former set of industrial sites, and then tries to turn them into a public park. Public space in New York, particularly in Queens, is extremely valuable and extremely important. So here was an opportunity to take that little overlook and turn it into a kind of a belvedere, a sort of a public place to see and be seen, a public place that would extend you out over the water so you had a sense of in a way, inhabiting the river. In that sense, also by levitating, you get a much more panoramic view, but you can create a new wetland, which you see at the base of this kind of overlook, this giant, about 64-foot cantilever overlook. You can see the creation of new wetlands, or the recreation, in effect, of the wetlands that were there. But this also involved ingenious construction. Again, our work with a whole host of incredible collaborators allowed us, in this case, to work with a boat builder in Maine and to prefabricate large chunks of this structure and bring them and hoist them onto the site. So here you can start to see that kind of overlook as a companion, or as a kind of in its reciprocal relationship to the new and constructed wetlands. Again, these wetlands are completely artificial. They're highly engineered, but they are a way in which, as Marion talked about, developing an idea of resilience, of rather than fighting the influx of rising tides, to let that kind of like jujitsu work with the kind of dynamic of a more fluid and sponge-like waterfront. So at times, they're extremely, depending on the season, very verdant, almost kind of emerald-like. At times you're above and you're very much in the artifice of the city. At times you almost literally feel like you're walking on water. And again, that sort of sense of dynamic between city and waterfront, and how we hope this park will be perceived and inhabited. So we'd like to conclude this evening's lecture with a firm belief in architecture's capacity to create new connections where none had existed. And it's in its transformational potential to invent new realities and to invent new horizons. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Where you would hear thunderous applause. I think we've unmuted everybody. So if I can ask everybody for a round of applause, now is your moment.
Just going to be the host, and unfortunately.
Okay. So this is the one part, unfortunately, that we haven't gotten down in Zoom, but we're going to work to perfect. So I'm going to start out by asking a couple questions that we can maybe have a discussion. And I'm going to ask those for all of our guests to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to type in questions. And I've noticed there are also some that are in the chat box that I'll come to as well. But if you can do it through the Q&A, and I will ask the questions, and we will do it this way. So the first thing I wanted to maybe talk about was what you had started with. Obviously, one of the strengths of your work has been your ability to cut across disciplinary boundaries. And I think, and find a kind of strong synthesis linking architecture, urbanism, and landscape. And one of the things that I think is really phenomenal is that it doesn't just happen at the large scale projects that are urban in scale or that are landscape projects, but that you use the concept of landscape to rethink architecture at the smaller scale or highly architectural projects. And you stated in your own conceptual positioning, and I'm going to quote you on this, that the territory of architecture should concern itself with the whole of the built environment, heighten disciplinary distinctions between architecture, art, ecology, landscape architecture, engineering, and urban planning, marginalize the status of the architectural project, precluding new paradigms for contemporary settings. And you've also written that each project, regardless of scale, is a fertile site to test the capacity of a broader definition of design as an instrument that shapes contemporary culture. I think that's a fantastic statement. And I'm extremely interested to know how you think that this attitude changes our typical modes of operation of architects, landscape architects, and planners, how you work with consultants to enable this kind of synthesis in your own work. And in particular, and this is more in relation to the education of our disciplines, because I know you're both also educators, how you think that this way of thinking might impact the ways that we're educating students now and the conceptual framing of the projects you take on. I mean, because Marion, you had talked about this as kind of the administrative components, let's say, of our disciplines. We could talk about it through licensing, et cetera. But it's a kind of question, should we be rethinking those disciplinary structures, or how do you see it impacting education?
Well, I'll begin, and I know Michael will have a few things to add. And Isla, you've sort of unpacked a huge selection of questions that really are at the heart of the things that we need to all be agile in our reflections, because there's no singular answer. We're certainly finding as educators that the dual degree is now becoming a more desirable and more normative goal. Certainly at UVA, you all have landscape and architecture dual degrees. At Penn, where I teach, we have the same thing. And people are finding that it's the plus, plus, and plus, but plus the expertise that they need to actually become, in a sense, beginners in some fields, but beginning enough to be able to appreciate in some cases what a specialty consultant can bring to the table. For us, the real goal, though, is to see that there are questions that are so large that you really can't be polishing the head of the architectural pyramid and yet answering the sites that are far deeper as they situate themselves on sites that are far larger than even the footprint or property line. And so it really, for us, is about constructing a site to bring into focus a set of questions that are going to be different for each project.
Yeah, I would sort of piggyback a few thoughts. I think you actually asked three questions that were commingled into one. And I think, yes, both Marion and I teach. I teach up in urban design, and I love the idea of urban design because you can't really define it in terms of scale. It could be defined in terms of a bench. It could be defined in terms of how you see a city. But I think to state maybe the obvious, in the last 10 or 15 years, we have been confronted with such a kind of a series of environmental challenges of a scale that can't be solved by any one discipline. And I think even 20 years ago, when we were just starting out, it became evident that we were interested in a much broader toolbox, so to speak, and not just a toolbox that would be sort of generated by us, but a toolbox with which we could engage consultants and specialists. So we're big advocates of interdisciplinary thinking, but also having said that, I'm kind of reminded of, I think, a statement that Hal Foster had made, which is before you can have interdisciplinary thinking, you have to have disciplinary thinking. And I think it's very important for us to also realize that we have to be strong enough in our respective disciplines to bring a group of people together to solve larger problems. And I think that's something that we've learned over time, that the kind of generalization is extraordinarily important in terms of defining a solution to a problem, but we have to have a team of folks working with us who are acutely precise about their strengths.
No, that's great. I think we often talk about that with our students in terms of, let's say, leveraging more teamwork that's project-based, but also perhaps thinking that the members of the team bring different things to the table. Mm-hmm. Often, and that happens at least in our research studios where we have architects and landscape architects and also urban planning students who are doing our urban design certificate potentially involved, so that each can kind of bring their expertise to the table to have that conversation. Mm. Another quality that I wanted to touch on that I think is really key to your work has to do with your approach to research at the outset of the project and the process that you use to guide you. Process is obviously something that we very much emphasize in academia because we are always trying to teach students about the development of a design process and how design research is a key component of this. And you've talked about this process in terms of uncovering the opportunities of a project, which I think is really interesting, or ways of discovering, I might even say, ways of reconstructing its physical and cultural identity. And perhaps you could speak a bit about your modes of research and design methodologies, the ways in which you both create and discover a project's physical and cultural identity? Where do you often start?
Yeah, great question.
It's a great question, and for us, research is in many ways a place where you want to enter anywhere and start unpacking every possible dimension, both seen and unseen, about a site and a subject and a place. And what we like to do is actually, in some cases, create timelines for ourselves so we can find the threads of intersections. And say in the case of La Brea, we're looking at both deep paleontology and Hollywood and trying to find threads of spectacle that has to do with both this crazy fact of urban paleontology right in the middle of the city, you know, and drawing out as long as possible and postponing conclusions as long as possible in our research allows threads to kind of, in a sense, steep in our sensibilities, but also start to inflect in our understanding of what they might mean to each other. And that, in conjunction with being able to do conceptual models where we're not thinking, studiously not thinking, but actually trying to reveal things to ourselves, it's the duality of those forms, both analytical research and then physical making, that starts to allow us to shed the too many parts to find out and distill what the fewest parts are that could have the greatest expression.
Yeah, and also, Isla, there's always, we've thought about this a great deal, and particularly in receiving a medal and award like this, it gives us a chance, I think, to reflect on our past work and also think about how to use this as an opportunity to project forward. And I think we always get a little nervous when we try to look too deeply at how we research for fear that somehow we're going to ossify this process. But there are several, I guess, techniques or interests, and I suppose prejudices that we bring to the research. We're very interested in the multiple histories of sites, and I think always drawn, in some ways, it might be as much an opportunity for us to gravitate towards sites that have complex histories that are, in a way, orphan sites, aren't so clearly defined. They've sort of fallen off the edges. They are, you know, you mentioned abused sites. We think that in a way is something that draws us. So we're as much drawn to sites that have those multiple histories as we are trying to uncover them. But then the role of consultants, the role of specialists, the role of folks in our office becomes important, because then you bring them into this process and each has a particular lens against which you can test a particular hypothesis. And we do try to not be so teleological that we start with research, then develop a design. We're always oscillating between a hunch about what a design might be and the research that's going on in a way in which we can maybe give that fledgling design some sort of, give it a skeleton, so to speak. So there's always a toggling between the projective and the analytic. And we think that's actually healthy at least in how we work.
No, I think that's really interesting. I'm going to ask the two of you, if you wouldn't mind, to stop sharing your screen. And that way you will become full screen for all of our guests. So, you know, maybe the last, my last.
Go at the top. Stop share. Yeah.
Sorry, at the very bottom where you have share screen, you should be able, or at the top, yeah, you should be able to.
Yep, the top. Yep.
Thank you.
Wow.
So the last thing I wanted to, my last question, and then we've got a fair list of questions and lots of clapping, virtual clapping, is around form and material. You know, I had noted in the introduction, my introductory citation of the lecture, that on the one hand, there's a strong relationship between the forms that you're operating with, you know, the kind of folded landscape or zigzagging, the oblique and the skewed line get used a lot, let's say, as well as curvilinear surfaces, et cetera. that produce continuities and support the kinds of choreographies that you're developing. And yet, on the other hand, I would say that the work is seldom described or defined in an overly formal way. That form is used to produce maybe a set of experiences more than to become identifiable in and of itself. And I think that's a really interesting kind of way to think about the work. And I would also consider the work to be highly humane without being anthropocentric, you know. Can you maybe talk about some of the formal and material strategies that you use and how these devices become operative for you? I think it would be interesting also to know how these translate from one project to the next for you. It's always the question of how a practice does or doesn't have an identifiable oeuvre, we could say, or, you know, set of forms. And I think someone else in our audience had asked the question about, you know, do you have a kind of consistent vernacular toolbox? Maybe unpack that a bit, how you think about form, material, and its relationship to experience.
Mm-hmm. You want to start, or I can jump in too?
Well, you know, it's a great question, and it's one where we find that we like to postpone conclusions about the kind of material expression until we have some insight about to what extent is the earth in many ways our first material that we're going to be working with. And as we start to shape that, the elements that emerge from the earth take on different characters, either in contrast to or in conjunction with. So in the case of the Museum of the Earth, it was so clear that that concrete had an opportunity to be very tactile in its expression of something that was hosting a paleontological collection. And in other cases, we wanted to fully dematerialize our understanding of what that material might be, and the kind of mystery then of an externally acid etched, you know, terracotta chromatically embedded glass could evoke the character and tactility of brick without actually being brick. And so in many cases, each particular project evokes a new inquiry, a new form of research, usually something we've never done before, or we hope we've never done it before. And that kind of pulls out maybe the kind of tactile material expression for each one.
Yeah, I would say even projects like Mary mentioned, Museum of the Earth, that go back several decades, there's been a consistent interest in the material presence, the reality of architecture. And I think so much of what happens in our culture today is purely visual. It's highly digitized. We're living in a world where there are no frictions, literally. And I think one of architecture's great gifts at this particular moment is to remind us what it means to live in the real world at a particular moment. So the roughness of concrete with glass, which is often thought of as a material, it doesn't exist, it disappears. We're really interested in etching it so that the exterior had a softness to it, a presence. In the case of Kent, we love the imperfection of the beehive kiln, and we're, in that case, very proud of the fact that that kiln was, in a way, brought back into production because we just were frustrated with the smoothness and the monochromatic quality of bricks. So this kind of tactility was important. And again, I think as we start to see how architecture is used or how our architecture is inhabited, we're starting to appreciate the very visceral tactile qualities that someone who knows nothing about architecture can appreciate.
I think I just would add one thing. Sometimes there's performative issues that come to stake a claim. There's seismic issues that we had to address both in the Olympic Sculpture Park and also at Hunters Point South Waterfront Park. And if you look at those precast panels that are both retaining walls and earthworks, they overlap. And they overlap so that if there is a seismic event, rather than the walls cracking or crumbling or failing, they slip. And so those are the kinds of things that sometimes inform not just a material expression, but actually the formal relationship of one material against the other.
No, I think it's incredibly interesting. And I also think at another scale, like moving up from the material, thinking about the architecture of the section or a landscape. When I look at, you know, the Kent project, the project in Barnard, so many of your projects actually think, you know, take a building and redefine the kind of typical stratification of floor plates so that it becomes a landscape to be traversed, you know, and the section becomes so important for that. And that's one of the strengths that also ties it back to the urban realm, right? To the ground in another way, and rendering that visible, because I think the other piece that's important is the way in which that gets rendered visible to the outside world, so that I understand that relationship from a distance, not just when I'm inside it. Maybe I'm going to pull from some of the questions, and because you were talking about material, and I love the idea of the color of the brick in the Diana Center, for example, that becomes glass. You know, it's something that should be thought about very much in relation to our own campus, where no one can think outside of brick. So that's a great moment. But Mark had asked, I would love to hear about the role of different kinds of drawings that they play in your process, from your Conti and charcoal tone sketches to diagrams to photorealistic renderings. Do you still build physical models?
We absolutely build physical models. In fact, we would love to do kind of a parallel lecture, which is all the study models, some which were left on the cutting room floor, all the ones that have been torn apart and reassembled. And there is, for sure, I think, as much to be learned by the mistakes of model building and model making. And for us, I think that's, along with the kind of the mistakes that we can make with charcoal drawings, the mistakes that we can make with perspectives that are not created from the computer. I think we like the precision and the mistakes working side by side so that we can stay honest, but also stay loose.
Yeah, I think right now in this kind of particular moment, and it's not just architecture, it's engineering, sciences, often we're the victims of particular programs, and we really try to resist working with one program to the point we become so facile with that program that inevitably it's going to drive us rather than we driving it. So we try on current projects to really look at them through the lens of sophisticated digital imagery. The idea of movement, I think, is fantastic. We love the kind of the sense of building through videos, but we also want that kind of immediacy of a very crude model. And we found actually that there still is a sort of a reluctance to enter into a dialogue when 5 or 6 people are around a screen, as opposed to the kind of the reality of a very simple model positioned around a table. Even with very sophisticated clients, the immediacy of that model is palpable.
No, I think models, we are continually underscoring the importance of models to our students. Of course, the end of this semester is a challenge for us, but they're still making them, just showing them to us, you know, from a distance. So Curtis Hoberman asked, and this is a difficult one, it's kind of like, which one of your children do you love the best, right? Is there a particular project that continues to provide you great joy and a strong sense of professional and personal accomplishment? You know, my assumption is going to be that you would say all of them, but I'm interested to know if there are particular projects.
I think I'll let Marion answer that question.
Actually, it is really a question of all the children, because every one of them, for various reasons at various times, have not only given us incredible pleasure and pain as we've developed them and seen them realized, but they continue to provoke us as we see them both thrive and struggle in various ways. And so each one becomes, you would say, a beloved child and a problematic adolescent at different times.
And then an intelligent adult.
And then an intelligent adult, we hope, that actually operates very well without our babysitting. And so it really is an impossible question to ask and answer, because every one of them is what gives us what I would call the full dimension of the orchestra of what we have been fortunate enough to be able to work on. And, you know, hopefully these projects continue to endure and have lives of their own that were never even scripted in the original brief.
Heidi Leinbach asked, and I hope, Heidi, I'm pronouncing your last name correctly, how will communal spaces in your designs be impacted based on your perspective after COVID-19? I mean, I think
great
question.
It's a fantastic question.
Yeah, great question.
Really great question.
And we've been actually thinking about that in the context of New York, where we're, you know, faced with an extraordinarily difficult and tragic set of circumstances. I think and this may sound counterintuitive, but I think it has reinforced the conviction that true public space is more important than ever. And if you're a family where you don't have a large house and a front yard and a backyard to social isolate yourself, the ability to walk in a street and sure, maintain the kinds of distances, but go to a park is more important than ever. And we see people inhabiting open space in New York in very careful ways, but the sense of a horizon, the sense of hope is absolutely essential.
And I think just to add to that, and we've been both reflecting on this, we've been writing about it, and in a sense, thinking more and more about whether it would change, and certainly the need to actually have more generous public space and invest in it as a shared amenity that really draws the community together with breathing room to be a part if necessary is incredibly crucial, because it's just the eye contact that we can make with each other. It's the vista that we can get to their eyes and the sound of birds, or even just the sound of people around us, that remind us that we are in fact a larger community. We're not just a series of isolated individuals protecting ourselves. And so our sense is that now more than ever, the public realm is going to become incredibly meaningful.
Yeah, no, I think that architects should be using this moment to remind the public how important physical space actually is, and the public realm for exactly those reasons. I think, you know, people have been asking the question on the opposite side, you know, oh, well, now that we're operating in this virtual realm, you know, do we need physical spaces? And at the same time, I think we all recognize how absolutely important this is. John Kett had said you talk in a few cases about collaborations with fabricators and builders, but could you speak to your collaborations with other design practices and how this informs your work?
Well, I think Hunters Point, for example, we collaborated with Thomas Balsley, also Arup, a large engineering firm, and I think
great ecologies on the environmental wetlands.
Great ecologies to reconstruct wetlands. And again, once there's a sort of idea on the table that others can share and critique, the collaboration becomes much richer. To use Hunters Point as an example, we found that building that overlook would be very difficult under conventional construction technologies or with conventional construction technologies. So we found that by prefabricating it, building it with builders that build nautical structures, it was much cheaper to do that and to have it brought to the site and place. So that sense of how you can fabricate also allowed us to develop a language, in that case, the language of steel plates, that was very much coming out of nautical technology.
But also, you know, MKA engineers who we worked with on the Olympic Sculpture Park in Seattle and who we brought with us now on so many of our other projects because they are so inventive of both structural and civil engineering, really brought to light when we had a massive crisis of budget where we had poured in place concrete supporting all the walls, and that cost more than the entire budget of the project. They introduced us to MSE, or mechanically stabilized earth, as the cheapest form of highway construction for overpasses. And without that, we would have never been able to realize, in a sense, what then emerged from there was a kind of trope or a language we developed with those overlapping walls to be seismically agile with the kind of companion of the mechanically stabilized earth. That came in a full dialogue with our engineers.
No, I think it's a very interesting one because it's also a question of how you know those opportunities are going to come to the table before, before you're deep in that problem. And so it's a kind of question around process, timing, working with the consultants sort of as a team from the beginning. Laura had asked a question, how do you find clients which have or encourage your clients to pursue the goals of sustainability, community, and connection that your work commits to? Obviously, great clients are a necessary part of any great practice. So maybe you can speak a little bit to your clients.
Yeah. Do you have any clients there to suggest, perhaps? All joking aside, I think it is in a way a relationship, and I think we found that the clients that are drawn to our work are also the clients that we are drawn to. And I think if someone's looking for a precious, beautiful house that sits apart from its context, we're not the right architects. And we've learned some painful lessons that we can't be what somebody else wants us to be if that's not deeply rooted in how we believe architecture should be. So I think it's a little self-selecting, and we have been privileged to have had some clients see work and come back to us with something that was really, that really struck us as being rooted in our own convictions.
I think just to add to what Michael's saying, for us, it's not only the clients that we find and they find us, is that we find that their questions and their incredible insight to postpone conclusions, to know that some things might emerge through a process as opposed to a client that might say, I want one of those.
Yeah.
That's what's really helpful. And I think our very best clients have been, along with us, trusting of the fact that a process is going to be something worth respecting and worth knowing that sometimes surprises can become wonderful moments for a hinge or pivot point in a project to embrace. And so I think we've just been very, very fortunate to have super smart, super curious, and open-minded clients who are, in a sense, they don't quite know where they want to go yet, but they want to know they want to go there with us. And that's the best kind of client one could possibly have.
No, I think that's fantastic. Jessica had asked, one of the many things I learned from you way back in 2005 was to embrace new forms of technology. You got our studio to learn and embrace Rhino, among other things. We also see from your work, I'm guessing this is a student, from your work that you both embrace nature and sight in your work. How do you think technology influences your work and our discipline? And how do you bridge the perceived gap between the natural world, and by this, she's meaning more naturalistic methods of design, hand drawing, with new technologies? How have you adopted modes of operating, or the hybridizing, let's say, of those conditions?
Well, just to, maybe Michael and I have maybe a couple of different ways of approaching this, but first and foremost, I think that every time these new technologies come on board, they create new formats with a predisposed intelligence, particularly if they're coming from technologies that are from out of our field, whether they're animation technologies that might have come through Hollywood, or whether they're fabrication technologies that have come through industry and production. Each one is adding to a set of opportunities for us to leverage. And yet there's something so intuitive about the hand and the instincts that are brought along with analog sort of ways of working and thinking, that it's the flexing between all of these. It's a little bit like a jazz band where every instrument has a chance to come forward, another one can come forward, and it's the conjunction of these different formats that often create great surprises and great opportunities.
I think there was another part of the question, Isla, that had to do with material forms, natural forms. Did I hear that?
More about integrating, both analog and digital tools, material, natural in the sense of using your hands.
Got it. Yeah. There are two things actually that I would add to Marion's point. We also like tools where accidents can happen, and sometimes they're digital. You can mess up a program and something weird happens. It prints out in a very odd way. We also love the, charcoal because it gets smudged in ways that you can't predict. So we're drawn to both very sophisticated tools and very crude tools, provided that there's an opportunity to kind of mess with them a little bit and in a way to play with them. Because if they're too closed, if the system is too closed, then again, you become a function of the program rather than the other way around.
Yeah. So Nika's asking, this is more a follow-up about interdisciplinarity. She's asking if you look for projects that are already a weaving of building, landscape, and infrastructure, is that, do you seek out project briefs that are actually bringing that interdisciplinarity to the table? Is that a part of a strategy, or conscious or unconscious?
Yeah, it's definitely, yeah. I mean, I think we're all drawn to certain projects, and, some of our colleagues love the idea of doing high-rise buildings. I think every architect, every artist, every writer is drawn to a particular mode of expression. And I think we look for projects where there's a little bit of interdisciplinary debris.
And just to add to that, I think that what we like are really open-ended questions, and questions that can't be answered in one particular way, with one particular sort of disciplinary lens being the solo lens by which we would take it on. And sometimes it really is that there's a deep history of research that needs to be brought to bear of both an urban idea and maybe an idea about technology. We're working on a building right now that's coming out of the ground sort of as part of MIT's Kendall Square area. And that's a case where the idea of being able to create a reflection of that urban district and also the tactile chroma of the kind of brick of the origin buildings there is leading to a sort of an origami folded plate tower that's coming out of the ground. And so you could argue, well, that's not the classic sort of landscape and architecture, but it is an opportunity literally to allow the landscape of the urban fabric to become reflected and brought to the surface of that skin. So the questions are really quite broad.
Yeah. Beth Meyer, Beth has a question. How has your concept of integrated landscape and architecture changed since you started practice? I can see some evidence of this in your work, but would like to hear your reflections on topics such as changing conceptions of ecology, non-equilibrium dynamics, shifting mosaics, or changing conceptions of public space, human-centered, contested spaces, multivalent, and appropriated versus multi-species publics, which I think is which I would expect, Beth, from you, from landscape architects: shared, singular, and controlled.
Yeah, well, I'll start, and that's not surprisingly a very complex and very interesting question. I think the one thing that has changed, and I don't know if Marion agrees, but for me, having now looked at some of the earlier projects through the lens of 1 to 5, 10 years, we've gone back to Seattle now, it's year 10 since it first opened. I think we're approaching both architecture and landscape, or the hybrids thereof, with a higher sense of humility. By that, I mean that there are certain things as a designer that you can do, and there's certain things that you have to let go. Now, in landscape, of course, that sort of letting go is much more evident in how good landscape designers, gardeners, landscape architects think. But I think we're also realizing in architecture, there is a cultivation to architecture that's crucial. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with the fingerprints of the author, the designer. The way inhabitation occurs is something that is surprising and marvelous and unpredictable. And I think that sense of unpredictability and I think humility is something we're starting to learn from.
I think just to add to that, there's really a lot more precision about the contemporary questions that we need to deal with. And the environmental questions are getting very, very clear in many people's minds about what, say, waterfront resilience might mean, about how we can avoid, adding to the carbon footprint, how we can be net zero. There's a whole host of questions that are being asked right now that allow us to leverage some aspects about what was natural years and years ago for cooling. And so how we work with the land, how you could even say that even McCarg sort of, the architecture without architects for various ideas have more and more resonance as we try to do less and less actually that costs our environmental footprint and more that is tied to its natural content. And so you could say that the inflection points between how we construct landscapes and architecture has become a continuum rather than a separation.
Yeah, no, I think on the, as a kind of follow-up on the topic of multi-species publics, we can use that as an umbrella topic. Martha had asked the question, COVID-19 sheltering in place has unleashed wildlife. With examples globally from leatherback turtles nesting in Thailand to goats overtaking a downtown village in Wales. How might nature's momentary freedom, and I'm going to edit this, Martha, for a minute, hopefully it's not momentary, inform how the human imprint might be contained going forward to encourage more of a balance with nature and impact climate change as well? And this is a kind of addition to the question around COVID-19, but from the perspective of the multiple species and thinking of it from the side of landscape.
Yeah, I would also maybe not reframe the question, but also open it up, because if you look at the air quality in Delhi a year ago and look at the air quality in Delhi now, it's just night and day, and the ability to create healthy environments, urban environments around the world has been completely transformed. And hopefully it doesn't take something as tragic and sad and disastrous as a pandemic like this to make us realize that air quality and the ability to nurture wildlife are not something that is an event that occurs only in a terrible set of circumstances.
Thank you. Gordon has asked a question. Back in 1993, you gave the inaugural Michael Owen Jones lecture, which is a lecture series for emerging architects that's chosen by the student body here. And I think this is a great, framing from the Michael Owen Jones to the Thomas Jefferson Medalists. So thinking about the span from emerging to established practice, I was wondering if you can think of a time over the past 27 years that you had to shift the idea that you had for your practice or the direction of your design thinking. Any catalyst moments, things that really shifted or shook you up in terms of practice?
I think that we often feel like we're at the beginning every single day. And when we realize that it's been more than 2 decades that we feel like we're at the beginning every single day, I could say that the thing that changes the most is the sense that with each new beginning, it's an incredible new set of challenges, an incredible set of new opportunities, new collaborators. And yet, if you were to say what's changed from the beginning and what's changed to where we are now, we used to have one project at a time. Every project was an only child. And now we find that we have only children sort of living in the studio side by side, and we refuse to sort of view it as a big family of projects. We still see them as only children that need our dedicated attention. And it becomes, in a sense, a kind of a new constellation of maybe a foundational idea that, started at the beginning and still endures.
Yeah, I think we remember well that lecture. It doesn't seem that long ago. I would say there hasn't been any cataclysmic change, but I think our interests and our passions then have really accelerated with the fact that we're facing global conditions of unbelievable magnitude that 10 years ago we did not imagine could be possible. And the whole idea of flooding, the whole idea of a pandemic, we knew that we needed to, in our practice, have a kind of a social and an ecological agenda, but that conviction has only become much more foreground.
Nino asks, I have always admired your work and the quality of design that you make accessible to marginalized demographics in the public realm at large. Why is it so rare to see public projects with humanitarian values executed with the care and resources that are exhibited by your projects? You know,
we ask ourselves the same question. Yes, it's sad.
Well, no, I think that it's very important that a lot of our projects in the United States are a little bit different than they might be in other countries in terms of the level of investment that's intended for the public realm. There is a predisposition, I think, to sometimes underfund the importance of our public space and even our public infrastructure as something that is of great significance for every population that can enjoy it and take advantage of it. And so arguably, maybe its rareness has to do with the rareness of vision to say that it's worth the investment and worth knowing that the public realm is something that is a thread that connects all of us together.
Is this something that you find you advocate for always in relation to the projects? I'm sort of curious about the kind of dialogue that you have with clients or those that you're working for, because I would assume that the advocacy is a key piece of this. This is...
No, that's a really good question. And again, in reflecting on a process, we firmly believe that you have to design the process before you can design the project. And in some ways, that advocacy starts perhaps discussion. It might start with an interview. It might start with a competition, but we try to foreground that immediately. And again, I think some clients are drawn to our work just as we're drawn to them. The Singh Center for Nanotechnology at the University of Pennsylvania is a perfect example of that institution was very interested in reaching out to the city. And we, as part of our competition or part of sharing ideas with them, talked about how important that was in our own work and tried to make that passion evident. So I think it wasn't us to them or them to us. It was really, I think, two kindred souls finding a kind of common ground.
Yeah. I'm going to ask, so there's a number of, in the Q&A box, there's a number of comments. So I'm going to say this to the audience. I'm going to pull one last question, but for everyone, feel free to write comments on the lecture, because lots of people have congratulated the two of you, and this is always a challenge in this kind of format, but we will share all of those comments with you at the end. So
thank you.
You know, please feel free in the Q&A box or the chat box to write your comments at the end before you leave. And I'm going to give the last question to Barry Bergdahl. Barry is asking, to what extent have designs been able to exceed the program given from Seattle to Queens? And maybe, you know, this is more about how you are able to mold the projects, you know, in the process. And if you have any tips for all of the architects and students, you know, that are here in the audience.
Yeah. Well, great question.
I think it's a great question that Barry asked, and I think it's the question that we're always asking of ourselves, which is, what are the questions that weren't asked when we've been given a brief and a site? And in many ways, what are the boundaries of the site that we want to break to be able to leverage its relationship to other territories? And I would argue that it's the unwritten questions that we're super interested in. Brooklyn Botanic Garden, we were given a site that was really smack dab in the middle of the garden, and we asked the question of whether it'd be possible to pull it to the edge of the city so that it could have an urban dialogue that it couldn't have if it was simply locked in the middle of the garden. And so sometimes it is a question of looking just a little bit further back outside the lens of everybody's first instincts to see what sort of secondary instincts might script a new language for a project?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and without exception, every project has developed into a different program from when it first started, and I think that's a function of what we bring to the table or to a project. It's a function of the kinds of clients who sometimes push us. And we can't think of actually a single project where there was a program and that's how it ended up. Every project, Seattle started with the idea of 3 sites and 2 bridges. That was the brief. Give us 3 separate sites for art and 2 very nicely designed bridges. Mm-hmm. What finally ended up was something far more comprehensive.
And I think even in very private projects, we're looking for a public dimension. If you will, we're trying to sort of tease out the public nature of projects that might be quite private. And that is partly our intention, but partly maybe a goal that could be drawn from a client that might not have been sort of spelled out in the programmatic expectations in the outset.
Well, thank you. I think, I mean, this is an ongoing conversation, but I want to first thank you on behalf of the school and behalf of our audience for sharing your extraordinary body of work with us. And I want to congratulate you again on being our 55th recipients of the Thomas Jefferson Medal in Architecture. It is an illustrious lineage from Mies van der Rohe onward, and we're really honored to have you with us today. And I'm hoping 2 things. One, that you got your medal in the mail. Good. And the second is that we will arrange something in the future when we're all back together to have you join us on grounds with our students and faculty. But I think it's been at least a great opportunity for a larger audience of alumni, and some of your classmates and others, your students, to be with us here today. So thank you again to both of you, and congratulations.
Thank you, Isla.
Thank you,
It's
Isla.
been a pleasure.
It's been extraordinary. Thank you.
And again, I would let all of our participants know to please feel free to write your comments. We will make sure that Marion and Michael get everything from you.
Good. Thank you very much.
Yeah.